Welcome, dear listener, wherever you find yourself tonight. Whether resting beneath the hush of blankets, drifting towards sleep, or simply seeking a quiet escape from the noise of the day, I invite you to breathe gently. Close your eyes if you wish and slip into a slower time. A time before electricity, before ticking clocks, when the world moved in silence and shadow. Tonight, we drift back to the long, uneven centuries of the Middle Ages, where candlelight flickered on stone walls and justice, if it could be called that, came not with fairness, but with force. Laws lived more in memory than on paper. Wrongdoings were paid for not in coins or apologies, but in blood, humiliation, and pain. There were no rights to remain silent. No quiet courtrooms. Justice came in the square, on the scaffold, beneath the open sky, where everyone could see. This is not a tale of cruelty for its own sake, but a quiet walk through a time when punishment served as ritual, a slow-moving display of pain, meant to remind the many by breaking the few. We will drift softly through dusty squares, gallows hills, and dark chambers, where even the smallest crime, a stolen loaf, an unwise word, could end in shame or suffering. Let the outside world fade now. Let your breath slow. There's nothing to do, nothing to worry over. Only the hush of words and the distant echo of footsteps in a forgotten world. And so the story begins, as many did in the Middle Ages, in a place both ordinary and terrifying, the town square, the heart of punishment, the stage where pain became law, and law became legend. The world moved differently then, wrapped in the rhythm of church bells and the rustle of cloaks on muddy roads, where the hours passed not by clocks or alarms, but by shadows sliding across walls and the distant toll of the vesper bell. And beneath that soft yet unyielding order, medieval life unfolded in patterns both predictable and perilous. For while most days passed in labor and prayer, in tending fires or fields or livestock, there remained always the quiet understanding that justice, if such a thing could be named in those times, did not arrive gently, and it rarely asked questions. It was not a justice meant to heal or to guide or to restore. It was a justice built to maintain, to reinforce, to remind, a justice that lived not only in laws and parchments, but in bruises, scars, and silence, and it moved with the certainty of thunder, though sometimes it arrived with nothing more than the creak of a wooden gate swinging open at dawn. This justice had little need for subtlety. It was loud and visible, shaped more by memory and example than by fairness or reason, and it walked hand in hand with fear. Fear of sin, fear of authority, fear of a neighbor's word or the priest's disapproval. Everyone, no matter how poor or devout, understood that to step out of place, even slightly, was to risk being seen, and to be seen was to be named, and to be named was to be judged. And judgment, once passed, did not retreat quietly into back rooms or sealed documents. It arrived in the center of town, in the daylight, in the square where gossip and grain were traded alike. There, punishment did not whisper. It stood, tall and still and merciless, waiting not only to correct condemned, but to instruct the living. The town square was not merely a marketplace. It was the heart of the medieval world, a place where every path seemed to lead eventually, whether one came bearing bread or secrets, coin or shame. It was open to sky and the crowd alike, a space where justice made itself known not in soft negotiations, but in spectacle. Wooden platforms stood at its edge like crude stages, and though they were silent most days, everyone knew their purpose. The scaffold might have been empty this morning and the stocks idle, but their presence never disappeared. They stood as reminders that order had weight, that the community was always watching, and that mercy was not owed to anyone. Children played beside them, dogs dozed near them, and still, even in laughter or trade, there was a hush beneath the surface, the knowing hush that one mistake, one misstep, could place you on the wrong side of that wooden frame. When punishment arrived, it arrived with ceremony. The sound of boots, the murmur of assembling neighbors, the cry of the town crier reading out a name, a crime, a sentence. Sometimes there was silence, sometimes laughter, sometimes prayers murmured under breath. And at the center of it all, the condemned, perhaps a thief, perhaps a woman accused of gossip or disobedience, perhaps a child, trembling and small, whose only crime was hunger or being unwanted. They would be led to the scaffold or the stocks or the pillory and made visible, not just to their accusers, but to everyone. That was the point. The visibility, the exposure. The punishment itself was often crude. A day locked into a wooden frame, head and hands held fast, or legs bent in awkward stillness. But the deeper pain came from the stares, the words, the waste and filth hurled by neighbors, the recognition that dignity, once stripped, did not return easily. Stocks were perhaps the most common, a favorite tool of medieval justice not for their brutality, but for their simplicity. A wooden board with carved holes, heavy and splintered, clamped over the ankles to keep the legs locked in place, forcing the condemned to sit for hours or days beneath the sky. And nearby, the pillory, a cruel cousin of the stocks, which held the head and hands aloft, locking the body in a helpless, upright pose that made movement painful and escape impossible. These devices did not wound the flesh, not usually, but they did something worse in the eyes of medieval society. They transformed the accused into an object, a figure to be ridiculed or ignored, mocked or pelted, shamed by presence alone. And in doing so, they taught a lesson without books or sermons. That disobedience would not be hidden, and punishment would be endured before the eyes of those who still had the chance to obey. The air around these punishments was thick with contradiction. There were those who felt pity, and those who felt anger, and those who simply watched without expression, eyes scanning the bruises, the dirt, the swollen limbs of the punished, committing the image to memory like a holy text. For some, it was entertainment, a break from monotony. For others, a ritual of reinforcement, something to murmur about over bread or ale. But for many, especially the young, it was a warning that lingered longer than any sermon. To see a neighbor in stocks was to feel the weight of the law not as an idea, but as a reality, not a thing to argue, but a thing to fear. The punishment rarely ended when the device was unlocked. Those who returned to their homes or their villages returned marked, not just by splinters or welts, but by reputation. A man who had stood in the pillory was not simply forgiven. He was remembered. A woman who had been exposed to the crowd did not resume her place. She was changed. The act of public shaming, though temporary in its duration, carried echoes that could last a lifetime. And for many, especially those without name or wealth to protect them, this echo could become a sentence all its own. They might find doors closed, faces turned, trust denied. In a world where reputation was fragile and forgiveness was rare, the punishment did not stop when the town square emptied. It simply faded into the silence of everyday life, where it grew like a shadow beneath every glance. And yet, for all its cruelty, this kind of punishment was seen as mild, a mercy, even when compared to the darker tools that waited for crimes deemed more severe. Stocks and pillories could humiliate, yes, and they could injure when the crowd was angry, but they did not flay or tear or bleed. They did not burn. They did not twist a body until bone cracked. And so, for the authorities, they served a useful purpose, a first warning, a visible line, a means of reminding the poor and the desperate that justice watched from every window and waited at every corner. But when shame was not enough, when a crime or a confession demanded more than splinters and stares, punishment shifted its shape. It became something harder, something heavier, something that marked the flesh not only with pain, but with permanence. And it is here in the slow turning of that idea, from shame to suffering, that we now begin to hear the sharp whistle of the whip, the tightening of ropes, the steady footsteps of the executioner. For there were those who watched in the crowd not with disgust, but with expectation, those who believed that pain alone could cleanse, and that justice, to be complete, must be felt as well as seen. And so we follow the story now, into the sound of lashes striking skin, into the rhythms of floggings carried out beneath the same sky, but with different intent, not to humiliate, but to hurt. There's a rhythm to it, not quick or sharp, but steady and deliberate. The rise of the whip, the fall of leather on skin, the pause between each stroke where the sound seemed to hang in the air like fog before vanishing into murmuring crowd. Punishment by flogging was not hidden. It did not take place behind stone walls or under cover of night. It happened beneath the same sun that warmed the fields and lit the windows of the parish church. It happened where the townspeople could gather, where their faces could bear witness, where children might watch with wide, silent eyes and remember for the rest of their lives. And perhaps that was part of the point, to remember, To let the sight of torn cloth and shaking limbs settle deep in the mind is a kind of education, a wordless lesson written in blood. The whipping post was usually simple. A thick wooden beam fixed upright into the ground, worn smooth by weather and use, stained by time and by flesh. It stood near the stocks, near the pillory, near the edge of the town square where visibility was best. There, the condemned will be bound, wrists tied high, back arched slightly, shirt or gown often removed or torn to bare the skin that was soon to be struck. It was not done with haste. It was done slowly, purposefully, each moment leading to the next like steps in a ritual. The appointed punisher, whether a constable, a hired whipman, or in some towns the executioner himself, will unfurl the whip, not always long, sometimes just short lengths of leather, braided and knotted, and then the lashes would begin. They did not come in flurries. They came in rhythm, like bells tolling across a valley, each one space to let the pain settle before the next arrived. There were rules, or so they said, limits. For petty theft, 10 lashes. For repeated drunkenness, perhaps 15. For a woman caught spreading dangerous rumors, 20 or more. But the rules were often shaped by the mood of the officials, the weight of the crowd's desire, and the reputation of the one being punished. If they were poor, if they were unloved, if they had no voice to defend them, the number grew. The whip did not ask questions. It simply obeyed the arm that wielded it. And so the cries that echoed from the square were not just cries of pain. They were cries of helplessness, of isolation, of people whose lives had narrowed down to a single moment, the moment of punishment, where time stood still, and all that remained was the next stroke and the one after that. There were many who watched with fascination, not out of cruelty, but because it was allowed, even expected. To be seen watching was to be seen learning. The punishment was public for a reason, and silence was part of the agreement between the state and the people. You may see this, but you must never forget it. And so they came, the baker, the butcher, the servant girl, and they stood near the whipping post as if attending a sermon. Some crossed themselves, some whispered judgments. Others said nothing, feeling a strange discomfort in their stomachs that they could not name, but which would follow them home and back again the next time the whip cracked in the square. These punishments did not belong only to the punished. They belonged to everyone. They became part of the fabric of life. For the one receiving the lashes, each second passed like an hour. The pain was not clean. It was jagged, smeared with sweat and dirt, and the shame of being seen. Blood came quickly, sometimes in thin lines, sometimes in welts that broke open like overripe fruit. There were those who screamed, and those who stayed silent, clenching their jaw until their teeth ached. And then, when it was over, there was no applause, no gesture of compassion, no gentle hand to lift them. The ropes would be cut, the body would slump, and if they were lucky, someone, a sibling, a friend, or no one at all, would help them to their feet and lead them away. There was no healing offered, no clean bandage, no balm. The pain was part of price, and so was the infection that sometimes came after. But still the post stood. Still the lashes fell. And in many places, this remained the standard punishment for crimes deemed disruptive but not yet damning. It was a middle space between shame and execution, a place where the body was broken just enough to leave a mark, but not always enough to end a life. And so it persisted for centuries in towns large and small, as predictable as rain and as unquestioned as sunrise. Every village had a whipping post. Every town square had heard the cries. It became part of the medieval soundscape, part of collective rhythm, a pause in the day where normal life halted and pain took the stage. In some places, the whip itself was given a name, not officially, but among the people. The red tongue, some called it, or the preacher, or the snake, as if naming it made it more bearable, more familiar, less terrifying. Children heard the names and stories and warnings. Don't steal, don't lie, or the snake will find you. And in that way, punishment became a character in the great tale of society, as real as the priest, as present as the Lord. And yet, unlike the Lord, it could find anyone. The whip knew no station. It struck peasants and merchants, women and men, and when it did not ask whether they deserved it, only whether they had been chosen. It is difficult now to fully grasp what it meant to live in that shadow, to wake each morning knowing that punishment could be waiting, not because of malice, but because of the simple, silent machinery of justice, always turning, always watching. And in that knowledge grew a kind of discipline, a weary conformity, where many learned to keep their eyes low, their tongues still, their desires tucked beneath the surface. They learned it not from books or teachings, but from the cries that drifted through windows and across cobbled streets, from the red welts they saw on a neighbor's back, from the blood that sometimes darkened the dirt beneath the post. Still, the punishments continued, and still the people gathered, and still the whip rose and fell, not as cruelty in a modern sense, but as the sound of order being maintained. There were worse things, people believed. There were harsher fates for those who failed to be corrected. For while the lash tore skin, it did not take life. And in the grim calculations of medieval justice, that made it merciful. But when mercy failed, when pain could not quiet the crime, or when the accused defied the whip, or when a crime touched the heart of power or belief, punishment had to become something else entirely, something deeper, something sacred, something judged not by men alone, but by the eyes of heaven. And so, when lash and shame were not enough, they turned to the oldest courts of all, not built in stone, but in superstition and ritual, in the blind trust that suffering itself might reveal the truth. It is there in the strange and quiet world of ordeals by water, by fire, by combat, that the story next leads us into a justice where the outcome lay not in evidence or reason, but in wounds and survival, in what was said to be the will of God. There was a belief, persistent and deep, that truth could not hide from pain, that when men could not decide, when words grew murky and confessions could be bought or forced, the answer must be sought not from reason, but from something higher, something older, something divine. And so, in a world where the lash could fail to silence and the stocks might not shame enough, justice turned to ritual, to ordeal, to the ancient conviction that God himself will reveal innocence or guilt through the language of suffering. It was not reason, it was not fair, but it was, in its own way, deeply trusted not only by those in power, but by those who feared them, those who lived under their rule, those who saw divine will not as a metaphor, but as something real, something that lived in water, in flame, in flesh, and in the wounds the flesh could or could not endure. Trial by ordeal was not called such by those who witnessed it. To them, it was simply a test, a divine weighing of the soul, carried out not in dreams or prayers, but in fire and water and steel. It was used when doubt lingered, when a crime was believed but not proven, when accusation was strong but evidence was weak, and when guilt was too dangerous to ignore but too fragile to prove. And in such moments, the priest and the judge, sometimes the same man, would call for ordeal, not out of malice, but from belief. The belief that God would not let the innocent suffer unjustly, and that pain, applied with sacred ceremony, would illuminate what law could not. One of the oldest and most feared forms was the ordeal by hot iron, a simple ritual, solemn and slow. The accused, man or woman, would be led to the church, sometimes barefoot, sometimes blindfolded, always silent. The congregation would gather not in judgment, but in prayer, for this was not considered punishment, but revelation. A strip of iron, thick and dark, was heated in the fire until it glowed red, not just warm, but white-hot with divine purpose. The priest would offer blessings, recite verses, sprinkle holy water on the ground where the test would take place, and then, with careful, almost reverent hands, the iron would be placed into the palm of the accused. They would walk 3 measured paces, holding the burning iron, not crying out, not faltering, not running, just walking, 3 steps through the presence of God. Once the iron was dropped, the wounds were bound, tightly, solemnly, as the people watched. There was no immediate verdict. For 3 days the accused would wait, hands wrapped, prayers whispered, minds unraveling slowly in the silence. On the 3rd day, the bandages would be removed. The wound would be inspected not by physicians, but by priests, by men who had studied not the body, but the soul. If the burn had begun to heal, if it was clean and dry and looked upon with favor, the accused was declared innocent. If it festered, if the skin blackened or bubbled or bled, the guilt was clear, no further punishment needed. The ordeal itself had spoken, and yet there were others, older, colder, heavier with dread, such as the ordeal by water, perhaps the most haunting of them all. For water, in the medieval mind, was not neutral. It was pure, holy, sacred. The water blessed by priests was believed to reject sin, to resist the guilty, to hold the body of the liar above its surface, as though unwilling to accept them. And so, the accused would be bound, wrists and ankles tied, sometimes with rope, sometimes with cloth, and they would be lowered slowly into a deep pool or river, not to drown but to float. If they rose, if their body stayed aloft, if the water refused them, then they were guilty. If they sank, if they slipped beneath the surface and the holy water embraced them, they were innocent. Sometimes they were pulled out in time. Sometimes they were not. Justice was not always patient. To modern eyes, these rituals appear senseless. But to the people of that time, they were no more strange than the turning of the seasons or the ringing of the bells. They were believed deeply, earnestly, without irony. And it is in that belief that the true power of the ordeal lay, not in the wound, not in the flame, not in the water, but in the quiet certainty that God was watching, that God would choose, that justice, when uncertain, will be made clear not by men but by heaven. And for many, this faith, however terrible in its consequences, was a kind of comfort. It meant that the world had order, that the guilty would be found, not by cleverness or cruelty, but by... And still, the rituals varied. There was the ordeal of the cross, less violent, but no less intense, in which two men accused of conflicting truths would stand before the altar, arms outstretched like Christ, and remain that way, unmoving, for as long as their strength held. The first to falter, to lower his arms, to tremble, was judged a liar. And there were ordeals by boiling water, where the accused would plunge a hand into a cauldron and retrieve a stone from its bottom, then have their hand wrapped and inspected days later, much like the trial by hot iron. The flesh told the truth, or so was believed. What is most haunting about these ordeals is not their violence, though that violence is real and sharp and unforgettable, but their stillness. They were quiet, sacred, performed not in anger, but in prayer. The pain was framed not as cruelty, but as cleansing, a holy trial in which the soul was measured by what the body could endure. And so people stood, breath held, as the iron was passed, or the rope lowered, or the bandage removed. There was no applause, only silence, only waiting, only the fragile hope that truth, if pure, would somehow shine through blistered skin or broken lungs. Of course, not everyone believed. There were murmurs, quiet doubts that passed between mothers and daughters, between travelers and strangers at inns. But to say them aloud was dangerous. To question the ordeal was to question God. And so the rituals continued, decade after decade, generation after generation, until at last, slowly, uncertainly, they faded, pushed aside by courts, by clerics, by the slow rise of something colder, more systematic. Not kinder, always, but different. And yet, even as trial by ordeal disappeared, the desire to see justice delivered through pain did not. It simply shifted its shape, from ritual to punishment, from prayer to performance, from God's test to man's enforcement. And so, when the sacred could no longer carry the weight of the lash, the weight fell once again upon the state, and upon the body. And now, our quiet path through medieval justice leads us away from sacred flame and holy water, and into a place where power wore no robes, where pain came not from trial but from sentence, where confession could be carved from the unwilling through instruments of cold iron, the torture chamber. It was a quiet building, often not the tallest in the town, nor the grandest, nor marked by any special sign. Sometimes it stood behind the courthouse, or beside the barracks, or below the keep, half sunk into stone and shadow, where sunlight barely touched the walls. It had no windows worth a name, no broad doors flung open to the square. What happened inside was not meant to be witnessed by all, not like the lash or the pillory, and yet everyone knew. They knew that when the heavy doors closed and the bolt slid into place, a different kind of justice began, one without spectacle, one without sermon, one that did not wait for divine signs or public approval. The torture chamber was a place where questions were asked with iron, and truth, or something like it, was extracted not by argument, but by pain. It did not arrive all at once. Torture was not the first answer to a crime, nor the immediate consequence of suspicion. It was a tool, they said, reserved for the uncertain, the uncooperative, the heretic or traitor who would not confess, whose silence was seen not as dignity, but as defiance to the authorities. Confession was everything. Not only a way to close a case, but a form of submission, a sign that justice had succeeded, that the will of the church or the crown had prevailed. But when words were withheld, when guilt could not be proven in open court or confirmed by the crowd, then the accused would be taken below, where the air grew damp and the walls were lined not with shells or scriptures, but with hooks, chains, winches, and wheels. It was cold, even in summer. The walls of these places held a chill deep within their stones, and the quiet had a weight to it. Not an absence of sound, but a presence of waiting. A table, long and wooden, often sat at the center. Not a place to sit, but a surface to be tied upon. Above it, a pulley. Beside it, a brazier, not always lit. And nearby, the tools, some small, some large, some deceptively simple. Pincers, wedges, screws, tongs, iron boots, belts. Each with a purpose. Each with a method. Each one designed not to kill, but to bring the body just to the edge, to that trembling, weeping place where the line between silence and confession began to blur. The inquisitors were not always cruel men. Many were quiet, meticulous, even devout. They believed, often truly, that they were saving souls, that pain was a means to an end, not vengeance, but purification, that through suffering, the truth would rise like steam from boiling water. And so, with steady hands, they asked their questions, and when answers did not come, they gave the nod, and the straps were pulled tighter. The accused might be stretched until joints cracked, or pressed until ribs groaned, or left suspended by the wrists, toes barely brushing the ground, hours ticking by in a silence broken only by breath and metal. They were not asked to die, only to speak, and speak they did, eventually. Words poured out between sobs, between gasps, between screams that echoed down stone corridors and lodged themselves into memory. Sometimes the words were lies. Sometimes they were true. Often, even the accused did not know which parts were which. Not anymore. Confessions were not clean, not carefully shaped or logically ordered. They were frantic, broken things. A name here, a date there, a gesture, a nod, a plea. And to those who recorded them, they were enough. They were written down, signed with trembling hand or a bloodied thumbprint, and they became fact. They were read aloud in court, in church, sometimes even in the square, and they were treated as if they had emerged from a mind at peace, not from a body racked by agony. There were limits, or so the law claimed, rules, time limits, guidelines for severity. But like so many rules in the medieval world, they bent in the presence of fear. Heresy, treason, sorcery, these were not crimes to be taken lightly. If the accused was foreign or strange or poor or already hated, the restraint grew thinner. Torture could be extended, repeated, varied, one method after another, and always the question, do you confess? Not because the answer was in doubt, but because it needed to be spoken, needed to be written, needed to be believed. What is most haunting, perhaps, is how ordinary it all seemed, not to the ones who suffered, but to those who ran the machines. The torturer cleaned his tools like a blacksmith. The scribe sharpened his quill. The priest prayed before beginning. They followed procedures. They kept records. They did not see themselves as monsters. They were fulfilling a duty, keeping the world in order, protecting the faith, preserving the law. And when the day ended, they washed their hands, closed the doors, and walked home beneath the same stars as everyone else. For the tortured, however, time fractured. Pain stretched it into ribbons. Some emerged alive but broken, with bodies that never healed properly, with hands that trembled and backs that bent where they had once stood straight. Others never left. Some died in the chair, some by accident, some by design. Their names were forgotten quickly. Their words, the ones carved from them, remained. The record stood. The truth, as it was wanted, had been found. But torture, like all tools, was used until it no longer served. And over time, slowly, unevenly, questions began to arise. From scholars, from priests, from kings. Was pain a path to truth? or a weapon that created only obedience? Did confession mean anything when it was bought with suffering? And as those questions grew louder, the chamber grew quieter. Not everywhere, not all at once, but the shadow that clung to those stone walls began to fade, replaced not by mercy, but by efficiency, by new laws, new trials, new punishments. Not kinder, always, but different. And so, as the world changed and torture retreated behind locked doors or faded into memory, the spectacle of punishment returned to the light once more. For there were still crimes that shocked the people, that demanded not just justice, but performance. Punishment meant not only to correct, but to frighten, to warn, to linger in the minds of all who saw. And so we stepped now from the hidden chamber back into the public square, where the scaffold waited, tall and silent, and where the blade would fall not in secrecy, but in full view, for now comes execution. The scaffold was already there, of course. It did not appear suddenly. It stood at the edge of the town square, or sometimes in the very center, like an altar raised not for worship, but for warning. A stage with no players but one, and no curtain but the slow descent of final breath. The wood was weathered, its surface smoothed by boots and time, its legs planted into the ground, as if to say it would not leave until all debts were paid. And around it, the people gathered, as they always had and always would, drawn not by cruelty alone, but by a kind of solemn obligation. To see justice done, to witness its form, to carry the memory home like a stone tucked into the pocket of the day. It did not begin at once. The crowd arrived slowly, quietly, their voices hushed, not by command, but by something older, a shared understanding that what they were about to see was not entertainment, not exactly, and not tragedy, either, but something in between, a necessary act, a societal ritual. The condemned would be brought forth, sometimes with hands bound, sometimes with shoulders slumped, sometimes walking upright but pale, lips moving with words only they could hear. Perhaps they wore rags. Perhaps they wore nothing. Perhaps they wore the very clothes they'd been arrested in, now stained and torn, as if time itself had started to forget who they were before this day. And around them stood guards, soldiers, priests, figures of order and salvation, though neither would offer comfort now. The sentence had already been passed. There was no trial here, no discussion that had happened elsewhere days or weeks before, in a courtroom or chamber or church, where names were read and witnesses summoned, where guilt was shaped like clay into something solid and inescapable. Now came only the carrying out, the last step in the long journey of medieval justice. And it was always public, always open to the air, because death, when given by the state, was not a private thing. It was a lesson written in flesh, a message sent to crowd and beyond, into every home, every prayer, every thought that strayed toward defiance. The method varied. Of course, in one town, it might be the rope, the gallows, tall and skeletal, arms stretched wide like the bones of forgotten God. The condemned would climb the steps, slowly, sometimes helped, sometimes pushed, until they stood alone beneath the noose, the crowd below them a sea of eyes and breath and silence. A priest might speak, a cry might be heard, but mostly there was waiting, waiting for the drop, waiting for the silence after, waiting for the moment when breath became stillness and justice was declared satisfied. Elsewhere it might be the axe, clean, in theory, swift, when the executioner was skilled and sober and unshaking. A block of wood, stained and scarred, waited in the square like a faithful servant, and beside it stood the headsman, cloaked or barefaced, known or nameless, but always feared. The blade, heavy and sharp, caught the sun like a second judgment, and as the condemned knelt, their neck bared, there was a moment, just a breath of stillness, when time seemed to hold its breath. Then the swing, then the sound, then the end, and the head, when lifted, did not speak, but it said something all the same. For those accused of greater crimes, heresy, treason, sorcery, the death might come by fire. Not quick, not quiet. The stake was planted deep, the wood piled high, the rope tied tight. A torch passed from hand to hand, until it met the kindling. The smoke rose first, gray and choking, then the flame, then the cries, sometimes prayers, sometimes curses, sometimes nothing but the sound of burning. The crowd watched. Some wept, Some turned away, but many stayed, because this was not only punishment. It was proof that sin could not survive, that wrongness would be consumed, that the world, though harsh, had order. Children saw these things. So did the elderly and the poor and the merchants and the priests. It was not hidden. Death in public was part of life. And though it changed them, though it left shadows in the corners of memory and silence in their conversations, they accepted it. They had to. To question it was to question the world itself. Better to believe that justice was done, that guilt had been proven, that the condemned had earned their fate. It made sleep easier. It made prayers feel safer. And the bodies, when they fell or hung or crumbled into ash, were dealt with not as people, but as symbols. Heads displayed on spikes above gates. Corpses left in gibbets, twisting in the wind. Bones drying in the sun. Ashes scattered. Graves unmarked. Each a message. Each a reminder that the law did not forget, and that punishment once given did not fade with death. In this way, execution was not the end. It was the beginning of a different kind of presence, one that lingered in stone and sky, in gossip and warning, in the slow shiver of fear passed from parent to child. But executions, for all their certainty, did not always erase the accused. Some became martyrs. Some became legends. Some became whispers that refused to die. And so the scaffold, while powerful, was never absolute. It silenced the voice, yes. It ended the breath. But it could not always quiet the memory. And that, perhaps, was its weakness. Yet still the scaffold stood. Still the rope was tied. Still the axe was sharpened. Because the system needed endings. It needed closure. It needed to show that order had the final word. And as long as crimes were committed, as long as fear could be taught through death, the crowd would return, and the condemned would climb the steps, and the sun would rise over a square that remembered too much and said too little. And in time, as minds changed and kingdoms shifted, some began to ask, quietly, cautiously, if there might be another way, if punishment could still be strong without being final, if justice could breathe without blood. And so we begin to see not a softening, perhaps, but a turning away from execution and toward exile, branding, mutilation. Punishment's not a death, but of permanence. And now the story carries us there, to the world of marks and scars, of burned flesh and severed limbs, where punishment became part of the body itself, not end life, but to reshape it forever. It was not always death that was chosen. For many crimes, not high enough for the gallows, not low enough for the lash, the sentence fell somewhere in between, a place where the body was not ended, but altered, where punishment lived not in the grave, on the skin, etched and burned and carved into flesh, so that memory would not fade, and shame would not be hidden. Mutilation was not always performed in secret, nor always in silence. It was often public, often watched, but it carried a different kind of weight, less spectacle, more permanence, a quiet kind of horror, the kind that stayed behind long after the crowd had gone home and the tools had been cleaned. They called it branding, though it was more than that. It was a symbol, a sign, a letter sometimes, pressed deep into the cheek or the hand or the forehead, usually with iron heated until it glowed with the soft orange breath of fire. The letter might stand for the crime, a T for thief, an H for heretic, or it might be a shape, a mark that only the locals understood, a sign that this man or woman had once broken the rules and would never be allowed to forget. The ire was not lifted quickly. It was held until the hiss of skin and the rising smoke told the crowd that the mark had taken. And when it was finished, the wound was not bandaged. It was left to crust, to ooze, to scar. The mark was meant to stay. It was a way of controlling movement. A branded man could not simply leave town and begin again. His face betrayed him. His hand revealed him. Wherever he went, the punishment went too. A village might drive him out. A merchant might refuse him. A guard might stop him before he reached the gate. In this way, the punishment extended across time, across geography, a shadow that lengthened with each step he took. For the crime of one moment, a loaf stolen, a lie spoken, a loyalty betrayed, he was remade, not just judged, but rewritten. There were harsher forms, too. Fingers removed, one joint at a time, not to kill but to impair. A hand taken for theft, a foot for flight, sometimes just an ear sliced clean, so the world could always see what the man had failed to hear. The law, tongues too, were sometimes cut for those who had spoken out too freely, too falsely, too often. To speak a lie was to invite silence, not the silence of prison or exile, but of an empty mouth, a tongue gone limp or missing. These mutilations were not revenge. They were structure. In the medieval mind, they created balance. A crime against the body of the law required a wound to the body of the man. What was broken must be marked. What was taken must be seen. It was not only men, of course. Women, too, suffered under the sharp decisions of justice. Adultery could bring the slicing of the nose, the removal of the hair, the searing of flesh. Gossip, especially when it touched matters of faith or state, might earn a pierced tongue, a split lip, a scar across the cheek to remind her and everyone else that words could be weapons and would be punished as such. There was no softness for gender, only a different kind of cruelty, shaped by the fears and expectations of the time. These punishments were often delivered without ceremony. There was no priest to offer last rites, no speech from the square's edge. The man would be brought forward. The tool would be chosen. The crowd might gather, or it might not. But always the iron waited. The knife glinted. The rope tightened. There was a moment, a final moment, and then pain, white and sudden, and then the change. And once the flesh had been altered, there was no return. That was the purpose, to ensure that some doors would never reopen, that the past could not be hidden beneath new clothes or different words. The body became the record, the scar, the sentence. For many, this was worse than death. The stares, the whispers, the constant reminders. A man might walk through a dozen towns and never escape the memory of the fire pressed to his skin. A woman might hide her face, but the absence of her ear or the slope of her scar would always betray her. Even those who felt they had repented found that the world did not forgive so easily. The punishment followed them not only through cities and seasons, but through dreams, through family, through the shape of every mirror and the hush of every crowded room. Yet still it continued, for centuries, because it worked, because it frightened, because it served a purpose. A lord could not brand a dozen people and keep it secret, but branding one publicly, deliberately, sent a message stronger than any proclamation. The mark was a message, and that message lasted. It could not be buried or bribed or washed away. It lived on the skin, on the bone, in the gaze of those. Eventually, some began to resist. Quietly, a merchant might offer a job to a branded man. A neighbor might help a marked woman cover her face. A priest in some distant village might argue that true repentance required forgiveness, not fire. But these were whispers, not movements. The system remained. The tools remained. And so the fire stayed lit. The knives stayed sharp. The mark stayed fresh. And in this way, justice became memory. Not just a verdict in a book, but a shape on a face, a limp in a step, a silence where once there was speech. And as with all medieval punishments, the question was not only what the crime had been, but who had power and what they feared most. And now, as we walk slowly forward once more, past the brands and the broken fingers, past the iron letters pressed into skin, we come to another kind of punishment. Not one that left scars, but one that buried the living in walls of stone. For when mutilation was not enough, and execution too final, there remained a middle path, the long, quiet cold of imprisonment. There was a kind of stillness to it, the sort that did not feel like peace, but more like forgetting, the slow erasure sound of sky, of color and time. Imprisonment in the medieval world was not always a sentence, not in the way we might think of prisons now. It was not typically a punishment in and of itself, but rather a waiting place, a stone-lined pause between accusation and trial, between guilt and judgment, between life and whatever came next. Yet for those who found themselves behind those heavy, iron-ringed doors, it did not feel like a pause. It felt like an end, a closing, a descent into coldness that came not with sudden pain, but with slow fading, like a candle placed beneath a bell jar. The prisons of the Middle Ages were not institutions, not formal systems of justice housed in long corridors and guarded gates. They were rooms, basements, towers, dungeons, often built not for imprisonment, but simply repurposed. The lower chamber of a keep, the storage vault beneath a church, the forgotten belly of a castle wall. And into these narrow, windowless places were thrown the accused, the condemned, the debt-ridden, and the disgraced. Some stayed a few days, some for months, some, forgotten by all, remained until their bones became part of the dust that settled in the corners of the stone. The walls were damp, the ceilings low. In some cells there were no doors, only grates above, through which guards might drop food or water, though not always. The ground was not flat, but uneven, packed with dirt or straw, crawling sometimes with rats or worse. Light came rarely, sometimes never. And in that darkness, sound changed. Footsteps became thunder, the drip of water a heartbeat, the groan of a wooden door a kind of distant promise that something, anything, might be about to change. But most often it didn't. They did not offer beds, or blankets, or comfort. Chains were common, not to restrain violence, but to reduce movement, to remind the prisoner that even in stillness, they were not free. A man might be shackled to a wall at the ankle, or by both wrists above his head, or pressed into a wooden frame so tightly that sleep itself became a punishment. And there, hour by hour, with no sun to mark the passage, the mind began to loosen its grip. Time dissolved. Hunger became a rhythm, thirst a kind of prayer, and loneliness, sharp at first, slowly dulled into something heavier, more suffocating, like a weight that sat on the chest and never moved. There were many reasons one might end up in such a place. Some were awaiting trial, accused but not yet judged. Others had confessed, but their punishment had not yet arrived. Some were simply too poor to pay their fines or debts, and so they were locked away until someone, a family member, a neighbor, a generous stranger, might pay on their behalf. But days passed, then weeks, and the world moved on, and those within the walls remained. Some prayed, some wept, some screamed, but most eventually fell quiet, speaking only when spoken to, if at all. For women, imprisonment carried additional dangers, threats not only from the jailers, but from other prisoners, from the silence itself. And yet, the stone made no distinction. It did not care who lay upon its floor, who clawed at its walls, who whispered the cracks or counted the scratches on the door. The prison did not punish actively. It simply existed. And its existence, dark, airless, indifferent, did the rest. Sometimes, if the prisoner was of higher birth, if they had wealth or title or influence, they might be afforded something more. A private cell, food from home, a candle, a servant allowed in to tend their needs. But even then, the bars still held, the door still locked, the stone still pressed in from all sides. Even the rich, in the end, found no freedom in the dungeon, only a slightly softer silence. There were no clocks, no calendars, no routine, and so the mind turned inward. Guilt festered, innocence soured, hope shrank. Some prayed more often, others lost their faith entirely. Some imagined freedom so vividly that it hurt more than the chains, and a few, the ones left longest, stopped imagining anything at all. Their eyes grew distant, their bodies thinner, their voices smaller. They became shadows inside shadows, breathing among the stone. But not all dungeons were dark. Some were placed in towers, high above the city, where wind slipped in through slits in the walls and birds cried in the distance. These cells were no less cruel, only different. There, it was not the dark that punished, but the view, a world seen but not touched, a life remembered but unreachable. To look out and see rooftops and roads and people moving freely, and to know that you would never join them again, was a quiet kind of agony, the kind that did not bruise, but burn nonetheless. Sometimes a pardon came, or a sentence was passed, and the prisoner was let out to the scaffold or the square or to exile. And sometimes the door opened simply because no one remembered why it had been locked to begin with. But for many, the door never opened. The jailer stopped coming. The food stopped arriving. The straw decayed. And in the end, there was silence again. Not the silence of stone, but the deeper kind. The kind that comes when breath is left and memory soon follows. Prisons in the Middle Ages were not built for rehabilitation. They were not meant to teach or reform. They were places of pause, of punishment, of waiting. But in that waiting, something was always taken. Not just freedom, but identity, will, light, voice. And that, perhaps, was the punishment all along. And now, as we leave the echoing chambers of stone and the long corridors of silence, we step into the world beyond the walls, into the space where power lives openly, where justice becomes theater once more, but this time not against a criminal, but against those whose crime was simply to believe differently. For in the medieval world, no punishment was more fearsome, more wide-reaching, or more merciless than that reserved for heretics. To disagree was dangerous. To speak differently, to doubt openly, to question not the crown or the court, but the soul of the world, the church, the doctrine, the sacred script upon which all order seemed to rest, that was heresy. And in the medieval mind, heresy was not just an error or a private deviation. It was a contagion, a sickness of the spirit that, if left unchecked, could spread like fire through a field of dry straw. It was fear of this fire, more than hatred, that shaped the cruel and thorough punishments reserved for those who dare to believe outside the lines drawn by bishops and kings. And so, with careful preparation and quiet ritual, the machinery of religious justice creaked into motion, slow at first, then relentless. It began often with whispers, a neighbor overhearing a prayer spoken in the wrong tongue, a traveler bringing tales from distant lands, ideas, customs, fragment of thought that did not fit the careful, ordered world of the parish, a young man quoting the wrong passage, a widow refusing the sacraments. At first, these were small things, and they were met with small responses, a warning from the priest, a fine, a public confession. But if the rumors did not fade, if the accused refused a bend, then the matter was passed on, upward, inward, into the careful hands of the Inquisition. And the Inquisition, when it arrived, did not do so with swords or fire. It arrived with silence, with parchment, with records. It listened before it spoke. It asked questions, again and again, slowly, deliberately, wearing down resistance not with pain, not at first, but with doubt, with repetition, with the pressure being watched and written down. The accused was not tortured immediately. First, they were interrogated, asked to explain themselves, to name others, to renounce, to return. There was always the offer of mercy, if not mercy of freedom, then at least mercy of the body. Recant, confess, come back into the fold, burn the books, abandon the thoughts, kneel. Some did. They wept and signed their names and walked home with heads lowered and hearts still intact. But others, those who truly believed, or those who simply could not pretend, remained firm. And then the tone changed. The cell door closed. The fire was stoked. The rope was coiled. And the process began again, not with questions, but with methods. Torture was used, yes, the rack, the strappado, the iron boots. But what made the punishment of heretics distinct was its purpose. This was not simply about confession. It was about the soul. It was about saving, or so the inquisitors believed. The pain was not revenge, but purification. To suffer now, they claimed, was to avoid greater suffering in the hereafter. And so, the torment was framed not as cruelty, but as a kind of grace, a final chance for the heretic to return to the truth before it was too late. And if they did not, if they still clung to their belief, then the final sentence came. Death, yes, but not by the axe, not by the rope. For the crime of heresy, the punishment was fire, the stake, the pyre. A punishment meant not only to end, but to erase. Heresy had to be burned out, not just from the body of the accused, but from the memory of the people. And so, the executions were public. The fire was built high. The wood was dry. The smoke was thick. The words of the priest rang out clearly, so that all might hear that this was not a killing, but a cleansing. The condemned was often gagged, not to prevent screams, but to prevent final words. There was fear that the heretic might preach with their last breath, might cast doubt into the crowd like a spell. And so the cloth was tied tight, the tongue silenced, the fire lit, And the people watched. Some cried. Some crossed themselves. Some watched in grim satisfaction. And some, later that night, wondered what quiet thought might one day make them next. But not all heretics burned alone. Sometimes they were burned together, dozens at a time, in great spectacles called autos de fe, acts of faith. These were not hurried affairs. They were planned, rehearsed, attended by nobles, sometimes even kings. They were processions, parades, ceremonies. The condemned would be led through the streets in simple garments, marked with crosses or flames, while the crowd chanted and prayed. And then, one by one or all together, they were led to the flames. The smoke could be seen for miles. The ashes were scattered, and the lesson, it was believed, would remain. And even when the fire died, the punishment continued. Families were shunned, property seized, names struck from records, graves left unmarked or defiled. The stain of heresy lingered, not just on the individual, but on the bloodline, the neighborhood, the memory of the town itself. To be a heretic was to be erased, not just in body, but in legacy. And yet, they continued to appear in whispers, in pamphlets, in quiet conversations behind closed shutters. Belief, it turned out, was harder to burn than flesh. In time, the fires burned less frequently. The Inquisition faded. The world changed. But the fear remained for centuries. The idea that thought could be a crime, that belief could be punished with fire, that a prayer, said in the wrong words, could lead to death, and that justice, when wrapped in faith, could be made to justify nearly anything. And now, as we leave the scorched fields of punishment behind, we return to the town, not the scaffold, not the cell, but the streets themselves, where ordinary people live with the echoes of justice around them. For not all punishment came from courts or priests. Some came from the crowd, from shame, from custom, from the strange, slow violence of being watched and judged by one's neighbors. There were punishments that burned, that broke bone and cut skin, that spilled blood onto stone and filled the air with cries. But there were others, quieter perhaps, less violent in form, yet no less cruel in their intent. These were the punishments of humiliation, public, enduring, and deeply personal. They left no open wounds to bind, but their sting often lingered longer than any lash. Because in the small, close-knit world of the medieval town, where every face was known and every secret walked in familiar shoes, shame could be a sentence all its own. It began with the square, that open space in the center of town, where the market was held, where sermons were given, where justice made itself seen. There, in the daylight, in full view of neighbors and strangers alike, the condemned were brought forward, not to die, but to be broken in a different way. The punishments varied. They could be creative, symbolic, even theatrical, but they all had the same aim: to strip away dignity, to transform a person into a spectacle, to turn an offense, whether petty or profound, into something the whole town would carry in memory. The pillory was among the most common, a simple wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, set just high enough for discomfort, just visible enough for public shame. The condemned would be locked in place, sometimes for an hour, sometimes a day, sometimes longer. They stood bent, unable to move, unable to shield their faces or wipe away the sweat or the tears. And the people came, not always in anger, but in curiosity, in obligation, in amusement. They pointed, they whispered, they laughed. Sometimes they threw things, rotten vegetables, handfuls of mud, even stones if tempers flared. And all the while, the condemned stood there, slowly unraveling, exposed not to pain, but to something quieter, colder, ridicule. It was a punishment that worked not through force, but through memory, because when the lock was open and the person walked free, their face remained. People remembered. Children whispered. Merchants glanced twice. It was hard to be seen after such a thing. Harder still to forget how it had felt. The weight of the wood, the heat of the sun, the silence that followed a particularly loud laugh. And in that way, the pillory outlasted itself. It didn't just punish in the moment. It reshaped the days that came after. There were other forms, too. The stocks, similar but lower to the ground, often used for lesser offenses. drunkenness, minor theft, unpaid debts. Here, the feet were trapped, sometimes the hands as well, and the position was humiliating not just for restraint, but for its awkwardness. The accused became a part of the street, passed by, ignored, stepped around like a piece of unwanted furniture. It was not dramatic. It was worse, perhaps, because of how ordinary it became. A person turned into scenery. Then there were the shame parades, walks of disgrace. A woman caught in adultery might be marched through town with her hair shorn, her clothing torn, her feet bare. A man who had lied or stolen might be forced to carry a sign declaring his guilt, hung around his neck like a collar, or wear clothing dyed a lurid color that would announce his crime long after the punishment itself had ended. The idea was simple. Let the community see. Let them know. Let the offense walk on legs and breathe with lungs, and carry its own burden to the eyes of the town. The punishment didn't require a court in these cases. Sometimes it was ordered by a local official. Sometimes it was carried out by the town itself, a kind of informal justice, shaped more by custom than by law. And though it may not have drawn blood, it was deeply effective. In a world where survival depended on reputation, where trade, marriage, even safety relied on how one was seen, to be marked as shameful was to lose more than pride. It was to lose footing, to lose place. There were more elaborate examples. The scold's bridle, for instance, an iron cage fitted around the head, with metal piece forced into mouth, sometimes spiked to prevent speech. Used primarily on women accused of gossiping or speaking out too freely, it was not only uncomfortable, but symbolic, a literal silencing. The woman would be led through the streets, the iron clinking with every step, while onlookers murmured or jeered. It was not only the metal that hurt, it was the idea of it, the message it sent about voice, about who was allowed to speak, and who would be punished for doing so. Public penance was another form, less harsh, perhaps, but still deeply shaming. The sinner would be made to stand before the church, barefoot, dressed in sackcloth or nothing at all, sometimes holding a candle, sometimes reciting prayers aloud for hours. The intention was repentance, but the effect was exposure, a private and made into public knowledge, a spiritual wound made visible. And though the church would declare the penance complete, the community often remembered long after the prayers had been said. And there were masks, grotesque, mocking creations made of metal or wood, designed to resemble the crime. A liar might wear a long, Pinocchio-like nose, a gossip, ears exaggerated to absurdity. They were humiliations turned into performance, tools not of pain but of derision, and once worn, they clung to the memory like a scent. People might not recall the details of the crime, but they'd remember the mask. And through it all, the goal remained the same: to teach, to warn, to deter. The punishments did not kill, did not maim, did not imprison, but they reached deeper into the fragile spaces of identity and belonging. They turned individuals into examples, into stories told in hushed tones or bitter jokes. And once someone became a story, it was hard to return to being a person. And now, as we slowly step away from the square, the pillory, the mask, the heavy ring of laughter and shame, we begin to understand that medieval justice was not only about punishment. It was about performance, about visibility, about shaping the world through fear and ritual. And as we walk further still, past the noise and the crowd and the stains of ridicule, we reach a different space. One where justice was not always directed downward onto the powerless, but sometimes turned upward into rebellion, into revolt. And in those moments, the punishments change again. Not everyone stayed silent. Not everyone bowed their head. Some voices, low and quiet first, grew louder until they gathered others beside them, murmurs turning into chants, footsteps turning into marches. Rebellion was rare in the Middle Ages, but it was never absent. There were moments, brief, trembling moments, when those without land, without swords, without crowns decided that they had endured enough, that the taxes, the hunger, the cruelty of those above could no longer be answered with prayer or patience. And in those moments, the very order of the world trembled. And when that trembling passed, when rebellion was crushed and the old structure set itself upright again, the punishments that followed were designed not merely to restore control, but to make sure such defiance would never rise again. The leaders were taken first. They were not always warriors or nobles. Often, they were millers or smiths, shepherds or former soldiers. They had no titles, only voices that others had listened to. And when the rebellion failed, as it almost always did, they were paraded through the streets not as prisoners of war, but as traitors. The charge was not merely disobedience. It was treason, a word that carried more weight than murder, more fire than heresy. Because to be a traitor in the medieval world was not simply break the law. It was to rip at the very fabric that held the world together. The punishments that followed were not swift. They were not clean. They were meant to be witnessed, meant to be remembered. A rebel was not just killed. He was unmade. His body turned into a message so loud that it did not need be spoken. Hanging was common, but not the quiet drop of a noose that broke the neck. No, these were slow hangings, where the condemned swung for minutes, kicking, choking, eyes bulging while the crowd watched in terrible silence. And if they were of greater rank, or their rebellion more feared, they might face the full, ceremonial horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was a process not hurried. First a hanging, but only until the edge of death, until breath fluttered like a candle about to go out. Then the cutting down, the stripping, the knife, the removal of what made them whole, entrails drawn out slowly, organs displayed to crowd. Some were burned, some were held aloft. The heart, still warm, sometimes torn out and shown to the still living man. And then, when the body could take no more, the axe, the limbs, the separation, head, arms, legs, each quartered piece sent to a different town, nailed to gates, left for wind and crows and memory. And the people came to see, not out of cruelty alone, but because they were expected to, because to witness was to learn, to absorb the lesson written in flesh. Children stood on shoulders. Old men leaned on canes. Women shielded their eyes and still peeked through their fingers. The punishment was a play, and the town its audience. And as the pieces of the rebel were carried away, so too were the final shreds of the rebellion itself. But it was not only the leaders who suffered. Anyone connected, by word, by food, by family, might be punished. Fines, imprisonment, loss of land. In some cases, entire villages were razed, fields salted, wells poisoned. The message was clear. Rebellion was not just foolish. It was deadly, not just for the rebel, but for all who stood too near. And yet, the cycle continued. Years passed, rulers changed, famine returned, taxes rose. And again, voices stirred. Quiet resistance, secret gatherings. Hidden scrolls passed hand to hand. And again, uprisings, some small, crushed in days, others spreading wide before being stamped down with iron and fire. And each time, the punishments returned harsher than before. Bodies displayed, names erased, monuments built not for glory, but for warning. And some rebels became legends, not officially, not in records or songs approved by the court, but in whispers and fireside tales, in half-remembered stories passed from grandmother to grandchild. The man who stood on the scaffold and smiled. The woman who refused to speak her betrayer's name. The child who carried the banner after the father fell. They were not saints, not in the eyes of the church or crown, but they were remembered, quietly, carefully, like embers hidden under ash. And through it all, the scaffolds remained. The ropes, the blades, the torches. Each rebellion gave new life to the old punishments, and each punishment gave new fear to those who remained. Justice, in these cases, was not about the crime committed. It was about the threat posed. The idea that the world could be otherwise, that power might not belong only to the few, was more dangerous than any sword. And so it was punished with a cruelty reserved only for the bold. And now, as we drift away from the sight of bodies pulled apart and villages silenced, we return to the realm of the law itself. Not its violence, but its reasoning. For behind every sentence, every gallows, every brand and chain, there was always a question: who decides what justice is? Who writes the law? And whose voice is silenced in the writing? We move now not into courtrooms of kings, but into the smaller halls, the manorial courts, the village hearings, where justice was handed out with familiarity, sometimes with mercy, sometimes with scorn. And in these smaller spaces, where everyone knew everyone, the punishments took on another shape entirely. Not all justice wore robes of velvet or was spoken from thrones. Much of it, in the long centuries of the Middle Ages, lived closer to the ground, in the village, in the manor, in the quiet rooms where wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of peasants and reeves, and where punishment was handed out not with the weight of politics or religion, but with the familiarity of everyday life. These were manorial courts, small, local gatherings of authority, where the lord of the manor or his steward would listen, decide, and declare. And here, punishment was shaped not by grand spectacle, but by proximity, because the accused was rarely a stranger. He was a neighbor, a cousin, a name known since childhood. And in that closeness, justice took on a different shape. The court would gather beneath a timbered roof or out in the open, depending on the season and the seriousness of the case. The villagers would be summoned by bell or by messenger, and one by one, they would file in, not in silence, but with a familiar murmur of people who had shared fences, traded milk, quarreled over livestock, and mended roofs together. There was no jury as we know it now, but there were customs. There was a reeve, elected by the people, and a steward, appointed by the Lord. The records were kept on parchment, scratched out in careful Latin or early vernacular, tied with ribbons and stored in chests. The crimes brought before these courts were rarely dramatic. No heretics, no traitors, but they were no less serious to the people who lived them. A man accused of allowing his pigs to root through a neighbor's barley. A woman who brewed ale too weak, sold it too warm, or failed to present it to the ale taster. A tenant who failed to turn up for plowing duty. A child who stole apples, not from hunger, but from mischief. These were the matters that filled the court. And in a world where resources were tight and lives closely interwoven, they mattered deeply. And so the steward would listen. The accused might speak. Witnesses might nod or shake their heads. And the verdict would come not from a trial, but from a process, a kind of public weighing of complaint and reputation, of past behavior and present words. And if found guilty, which was often the case, the punishment would follow. It might be a fine, small but stinging, a number of pennies owed to the lord or to the injured party, a warning, recorded for future memory, a task to be done as recompense, gathering firewood for the church, mucking the common paths, patching a fence not one's own. But sometimes, when the offense was greater, when it touched pride or property too closely, the punishment took on more visible form, a public apology, a walk of penance through the village lanes, a day spent standing beside the church door, silent and still, while others passed by. No iron, no fire, but the sting of eyes, the weight of whispers, the long echo of memory in a small place. And what made these punishments heavy was not their pain, but their closeness. There was no anonymity in the manorial court. The woman who accused you was the same one who sold you eggs. The man who testified against you shared your path to the fields each morning. The reeve who read your name aloud was your cousin's husband. There was no slipping back into the crowd, no chance to disappear into another town. What was said here remained. It was passed along in glances, in meals, in gatherings beside the hearth. And so, in many cases, the threat of punishment was enough to shape behavior, not out of fear of the lash or the noose, but fear of the village itself, of being the one spoken of in the next court, the one whose name made children giggle and elders frown. In this way, punishment in local courts served a different function. It was not just correction. It was maintenance. It preserved the delicate web of cooperation and dependence that village life required. But the manorial courts also revealed the deep imbalances within medieval justice, because the steward answered to the Lord, and the Lord answered to no one but himself, and sometimes the crown. So while the peasant who let his cows trample the Lord's garden might face a harsh fine, the Lord who raised rents or took more than his due faced no punishment at all. The structure was tilted. The court, for all its closeness, still served the powerful first. And though the villagers might grumble or joke about it behind closed shutters, they also understood that too much resistance brought heavier consequences. Consequences from courts far less familiar and far more cruel. Yet still, The local courts endured. For all their flaws, they were a kind of community theater, a stage upon which order was reaffirmed, grievances aired, reputations tested. The court sessions might end with shared bread, with ale, with laughter. A man fined in the morning might help his accuser fix a cart by evening. Life, in its fullness, went on. And in this way, justice in the village was not only punishment. It was ritual, a rhythm, a mirror of the lives people lived together. And so, as we now leave the low, smoky rooms of manorial justice behind, we find ourselves returning once more to the larger world. For while the village dealt in fines and small shames, the city, with its wealth, its danger, its ambition, required something more forceful. There, justice took on new forms, inventive, strange, sometimes theatrical, sometimes brutal, often both. We move now toward the city square once again, but not for hanging or stocks. We move now into the stranger corners of punishment, the creative, the symbolic, the absurd, where justice dressed itself not only in law, but in imagination. The city had a different rhythm. Its streets were tighter, its voices louder, its shadows longer and more tangled. While the village lived by the soft churn of seasons, the city pulsed with movement, of trade, of gossip, of crime. And so, in the twisting alleys and wide cobble squares of medieval towns, punishment took on another character altogether. It was not only corrective, nor always severe. It was at times theatrical, shaped not just to punish the body, but to shape the mind, to entertain the watching crowd, to transform justice into a kind of performance that stayed in memory long after crime itself had been forgotten. There were punishments so strange, so pointed, that they seemed to carry the echo of a joke, a cruel one perhaps, but joke all the same. A man who sold watered wine might be forced to drink it in public until he vomited. A dishonest baker might be paraded to the town with loaves hung around his neck, or even tied to a cart and dragged across the square, while a crier shouted his offense. A woman caught cursing too loudly in the market might be made to wear a heavy stone around her neck for a day, her crime etched on a placard pinned to her dress. These were punishments of ridicule, of symbolism, a kind of justice that worked by image and imagination. The creativity was intentional. The punishment had to match the crime, not in severity, but in meaning. It had to be seen, remembered, talked about, and in that remembering it would do its work. A thief might be made to walk the streets with his hands bound in front of him, coins tied to his ears, a bag slashed open and empty. A public drunk might be dunked repeatedly into a barrel of ale, sputtering and soaked, before being hauled to the market to dry in the wind. It was not always the pain that mattered. It was the embarrassment, the symbolism, the story, because the medieval city was full of stories. Every street had its rumors, every market its scandals, and punishment became part of that fabric. It was woven into the rhythm of daily life. Something seen on the way to fetch bread, whispered about over firewood, laughed at after supper. And so, punishments were designed not only to discipline the offender, but to satisfy the public eye. Justice, in these moments, became a kind of theater, grim, absurd, sometimes almost playful, though always serious in its purpose. Some punishments became local traditions, repeated so often they became part of the town's identity. In one city, a man caught spreading false rumors might be forced to wear a mask with a long wooden tongue. In another, those guilty of fraud were made to ride backwards on a donkey, clutching the tail, while townsfolk followed behind banging pots and shouting jeers. These rituals of shame and spectacle had a strange life of their own, part punishment, part performance, part community ritual. Everyone played a role, even if only a spectator. And there were objects, too, tools of justice not for pain, but for display. Masks with exaggerated noses for liars, bells tied to ankles for petty thieves, so that everyone heard them coming. Garments dyed yellow or red, signaling sin or scandal, worn for days or weeks as a walking reminder. These items turned people into symbols, walking sermons on morality, warnings, and motion. They made the body into a message, easy to read, impossible to forget. But the line between absurdity and cruelty was thin. What began as creative could quickly tip into brutal. A man mocked for his crime might find himself pelted with stones. A punishment meant to humiliate could become dangerous when the crowd grew angry or bored. And so, even the strange punishments carried real risk, not only of physical harm, but of lasting exclusion. To be laughed at by one's town was not only painful in the moment, it could linger for years. Friendships thinned, opportunities vanished. A person became their punishment, long after the sentence ended. And not all such punishments were mild. Some were deliberately designed to blur the boundary between pain and spectacle. A beggar caught pretending to be lame might be whipped publicly while walking normally. The lash allowed punctuation to each step. A woman accused of sorcery, not found guilty but merely suspected, might be forced to carry a candle to the churchyard at night, her face covered in ash, her hair shorn to the scalp. The image mattered more than the verdict. The punishment was not only about what had been done, it was about what others believed might have been done. Sometimes, those punished this way tried to reclaim the moment. A sharp-tongued woman forced into silence might walk with her back straighter than expected. A man paraded for theft might grin and joke, turning the jeers back toward the crowd. And sometimes, rarely, a punishment meant to humiliate ended up making the accused more popular. A kind of folk hero admired for their defiance. But these were exceptions. Most did not find power in the moment. Most bore it quietly, endured it silently, and carried a memory long after the crowd had moved on. What makes these punishments strange to us now is not only their creativity, but how deeply they depended on community. There were no walls between the punished and the watchers. No police cordons. No judges in wigs. Just people, all tangled together in the dusty streets of daily life. Try and keep order through ritual and ridicule, through story and symbol. Justice was not separate from the town. It was part of its theater, part of its rhythm, part of its breath. And now, as we step slowly away from these strange masks, these backward donkeys, these barrels of ale and painted clothes, we feel the world quieting again. The street grows narrower, the torches dim, and we find ourselves approaching a darker place. Not creative, not theatrical, but shadowed and still. For beyond the strange punishment of the city, there remained one constant throughout the Middle Ages. A punishment that needed no performance, no mask, no crowd. Only a blade. And so, we walk now toward the edge of law and life itself. To the sentence that ended everything. We walk toward the scaffold. There was a moment, always, when the noise quieted. Not all at once, not with a sudden hush, but gradually, like the tide pulling away from the shore, until what was left was a stillness too full to be empty, too heavy to be peace. And in that stillness, at the edge of the square or the crest of the hill, the scaffold waited. It was not elaborate. A platform of wood, weathered by sun and stained by rain, often rebuilt, rarely cleaned. It stood like a punctuation mark in the grammar of the town, visible from windows and alleyways, its shadow long even at noon. And though the city had its masks and jokes, its donkeys and ropes and bells, the scaffold did not laugh. It did not perform. It simply ended. Execution was the final chapter, the closing line of a story that had already been told in whispers and parchment and declarations, and now all that remained was a conclusion. There were many ways it could be done. Some were quick, others were not. Some were public, meant to teach, to echo in the minds of those who watched. Others were quiet, hidden behind walls, carried out in silence. But whether grand or small, whether crowded or lonesome, execution in the Middle Ages was not a private affair. It was a message carved into time, a final act in the theater of justice that could not be revised or softened or reversed. The method depended on the crime and on who committed it. Beheading was, in many places, reserved for nobility, a cleaner death, a death of honor, at least in theory. A single stroke of the sword, if the executioner was skilled, or the axe, though axes were less precise, and more than one blow was often required. The condemned would kneel, hands bound or left free, depending on custom, and the crowd would wait for that sound, sharp, short, final. The blade parting flesh from bone, and the head falling into the straw below. It was over quickly, at least for the body, but the watching eyes, the minds in the square, the children clinging to their mother's skirts, they carried that moment with them. They remember it not as an act of justice, but as a shape, a motion, a blur of color and sound that echoed quietly in dreams. For others, the death was slower. Hanging was common. Not the swift drop through a trapdoor, as one might imagine now, but a crude suspension, where the body jerked and twisted, the rope cutting deeper with every desperate movement. The legs kicked, the arms reached, the breath caught, and the world narrowed until it was only that one terrible struggle. The crowd watched, as always, but often in silence. For as much as justice demanded to be seen, there was something in the dying, the way the face changed, the way the fingers clawed at the air, that made even the most hardened look away. And then there was burning, rare but remembered, reserved not only for heretics and witches, but for those whose crimes were seen not just as offenses, but as contagions, as threats to the spiritual order. The fire was built tall, the wood arranged with care, dry kindling beneath, damp logs around, to lengthen the burning. The condemned was bound to the stake, not always standing, sometimes seated, depending on the method, and before the torch was lowered, there was often a prayer, not for salvation, not in truth, but for permission, a ritual reminder that this, somehow, was holy. The fire began low, then climbed, licking at cloth, then flesh, then bone, and the people watched, not always out of cruelty, but because they believed they must, because to turn away, in some towns, was to be marked. Better to stand and see, and pretend to understand. Crucifixion, breaking on the wheel, drowning. Each had its place, its time, its region. Some methods faded with time. Others returned in times of war, or plague, or fear. But the scaffold, in all its forms, endured. And what lingered most was not just a method, but the moment before, the walk to the scaffold. The final words, if they were permitted, the way the condemned held their shoulders, met the eyes of those around them, or did not. There were those who wept, who begged. There were those who sang. And there were those who said nothing at all, who simply stood, breathing, waiting for the end. The executioner, too, was part of this ritual, a figure both feared and necessary, cloaked not in robes of justice, but in the weight of repetition. They were rarely celebrated, often shunned, paid well sometimes, but kept apart. Their hands had ended lives. Their blades had stained the stones. And yet, without them, justice, as defined by the crown or court, could not be complete. Some were precise, even gentle in their own way. They tried to be swift, to spare what little pain could be spared. Others were clumsy, brutal, drunk with power or fear, and the condemned had no say. They waited, head bowed, neck bare, while fate walked toward them in leather boots. Sometimes the body was left on display, hanging from a gibbet, nailed to a tree, tied to the gate of a castle. Birds came, rain fell, children pointed. Days passed, and slowly, the memory of who the person had been faded, until all that remained was a warning. Do not follow, do not resist, do not stray. And yet, not all executions erased. Some created martyrs. In secret songs, in midnight prayers, in stories told behind shuttered windows, the condemned became heroes. Not because they lived, but because they had died without bending. And in those stories, whispered from mouth to mouth, justice was reshaped, repainted. No longer the tool of power, but the defiance of it. The scaffold became a symbol not of obedience, but of something deeper, of meaning, of faith, of courage. But these were rare. Most who died were simply forgotten. Their names scratched in the court ledger, their final moments remembered only by the few who had known them. A sister, a child, a friend too frightened to speak. The square was cleaned, the platform reused, and life, as it always did, moved forward, inch by inch, breath by breath, unaware of the footsteps that had once climbed that final set of stairs. And now, as we walk softly away from the scaffold, from the blade, the noose, the fire, we carry the weight of that silence with us, not to hold it forever, but to understand its place in the story. For justice in the Middle Ages was never only about law. It was about fear, about power, about performance. And sometimes it was about control, not of the body, but of the mind, of what people believed, of what they dared to imagine. And so, We drift now toward that darker corner belief, toward punishment not for action, but for thought, toward the places where no blood was spilled, but where the soul itself was caged, toward confinement, toward imprisonment. The fire had gone out. The gallows stood empty. The last echo of the axe had faded into the walls of the city, and still the world remained uneasy. Justice had not yet finished its journey, for there were crimes that did not demand blood, and yet could not be ignored. There were people too dangerous to walk free, too connected to be killed, or too troublesome to be seen. And for them, another form of punishment slowly took hold, one that didn't scar the skin, but instead pressed inward hour by hour, day by day. It was not loud. It was not public. It was simply silence, and stone, and time. It was imprisonment. Prison, as we know it now, with bars and uniforms and numbered cells, did not exist in the early centuries of the medieval world. To lock someone away, alone for years, was not only costly but strange. Punishment was meant to be seen, to shape the village, to deter the onlooker. But as towns grew and the machinery of rule expanded, as records multiplied and authority became more layered, a shift began. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the idea emerged that confinement itself, being removed from the world, walled away from light and sound and others, might serve as a punishment all its own. It began with dungeons, not as a sentence, but as a waiting place, a space below castles, behind monasteries, within the folds of thick city walls. They were not meant for long stays. A thief might be held there before the market day, when his hand would be taken. A debtor might wait there while family gathered coin for his release. But even a few nights in those places could feel like a lifetime. The air was wet, heavy with the breath of mold and old stone. There was no straw, no bed, often no window, only darkness, and the scurry of unseen things, and the slow dripping of water echoing like distant footsteps. The prisoner was not beaten, not directly, but the space itself did the work. And yet, over time, these waiting rooms became holding rooms, then cells, then chambers of forgetting. A woman who refused to name an accomplice might be left in such a space for weeks, then months. A man suspected of heresy might be given no end date, simply placed and left. The walls did not speak. The guards did not answer. The door closed and the world narrowed to the length of one's arms. Sometimes there was light, a thin beam from a high slit in the stone, enough to show the dust in the air, the bones of rats, the patterns and the mildew on the walls. Sometimes there was food, though rarely more than bread and water. Sometimes there was a bucket, sometimes not. There was no clock to mark time, no voice to break the stillness, only the turning of one's own thoughts, like a wheel grinding endlessly in the dark. The isolation was not always complete. In larger towns, the earliest forms of prisons began to appear, not yet built for that purpose, but adapted. Old towers, disused halls, corners of churches, and in those spaces, prisoners were sometimes kept together, not out of kindness, but necessity. And here, punishment shifted again, because to be locked in with others, all equally desperate, all equally forgotten, was a torment of its own. There were no laws within those walls, only hunger, fear, and whatever hierarchies emerged in the gloom. And yet, for those with coin or connection, prison could be softened. A nobleman accused of a political offense might be confined to a chamber, but with tapestries, with books, with servants. A merchant jailed for debt might bribe the guard for better food, for messages sent outside. Even in confinement, inequality endured. Justice, even when silent, still bent its shape to favor the powerful. But for the poor, the voiceless, the truly forgotten, prison was not a place to wait. It was a place to disappear. Records were lost. Guards changed. Sometimes the reason for confinement faded, but the door remained locked. Years might pass. Names might fade from memory. A man entered in youth and emerged gray, if he emerged at all. And outside, the world shifted. Streets were paved. Kings died. Markets rose and fell. And the prisoner remained, suspended in a place where time was no longer linear, where days looped like dreams and the mind softened like damp cloth. And yet, For all its cruelty, imprisonment was sometimes seen as mercy. Better than the scaffold, better than the stake, a delay at chance, a thin thread of hope that someday someone might remember, might intercede, might open the door. And so, some clung to that hope, scratched messages into stone, counted days with fingernails, whispered prayers into walls too thick to answer. And still, the practice spread. Cities built more holding rooms. Castles expanded their lower floors. Some monasteries, tasked with keeping spiritual order, constructed cloisters of confinement, spaces where the sinner might contemplate eternity, while the world moved on without them. The church, too, used confinement, not just for heretics, but for monks who disobeyed, for nuns who questioned. Silence was both a virtue and a sentence. Imprisonment, by its nature, left little to see. No crowds, no gallows, no torches or cries. But that made it no less real, perhaps more, because it was not a single act, like the axe or the fire. It was a slow erasure, a quiet vanishing, a life dimmed minute by minute, until even the prisoner could barely recall who they had once been, what they had done, or why they were here at all. And now, as we drift back up from those stone-walled depths, we carry the damp of the dungeon with us, the echo of distant water, the soft, crumbling shape of time when there's no markers. And though we step once more into the open air, into torchlight and starlight, we do not leave a shadow behind. For confinement, though often hidden, left marks on the world just the same. And as we walk now toward the last chapter of this long, quiet journey, we move not toward a cell or a square or a scaffold, but toward something older, something deeper, toward the reasons beneath the punishments, the beliefs, the superstitions, the fears of the invisible. We walk now toward the punishment of those who were not merely seen as criminals, but as curses. Some punishments were written in law, others were written in fear, and fear in the Middle Ages could be as thick as mist, settling over fields and hearts and minds alike. It did not need a name. It did not need a face. But when fear grew roots, when crops failed, when children fell ill, when lightning struck a church, or a cow gave birth to something misshapen, the people looked not to accident, nor to chance, but to something darker, something hidden, something whispered about in the corners of the village, or seen in the glance of a woman walking alone. And from that fear rose one of the most haunting chapters in a long story of medieval punishment, the punishment of witches, and of those believed to be touched by the devil himself. The line between superstition and justice was thin, and often invisible. The church preached of sin and salvation, of demons and grace. But between the sermons and the psalms, among the muddy streets and smoke-stained cottages, the people believed in other things, in curses passed through breath, in charms sewn into hems, in eyes that could rot milk or cause storms. And when misfortune struck, someone had to be blamed, a reason had to be found, and it was rarely sought among the powerful. More often, it was found among the poor, the old, the strange, the women who muttered to themselves, or tended herbs no one else could name. To be called a witch was not to be found guilty of an act. It was to become a symbol, a vessel into which a community could pour its terror, its confusion, its unanswered prayers. And once named, the accused had little chance to escape, for the very signs of innocence, quietness, calm, sorrow, could be twisted into signs of guilt. Why did she not cry? Why did he not protest? Why does she still smile? Why does he still live? The trial had already begun before a word was spoken. The punishments were not always immediate. Sometimes the accused was imprisoned, questioned, examined by priests or local judges. There were tests, crude, painful, strange. The water ordeal, where the accused was bound and cast into a river. If she floated, she was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent, though drowned. The needle test, where a bodkin was pressed into the skin to search for a witch's mark, a place that would not bleed or feel pain. Birthmarks, scars, moles, all might be taken as proof. Even a cat seen nearby could be offered as evidence. A familiar said to do her bidding. But often, proof was not needed. Belief was enough. And so the punishments began. Some were confined, shaven, paraded through the streets, their names cursed at every step. Others were scourged, whipped in public as the people watched, not always with anger, but with an uneasy sense that something was being set right, that the order of the world, tilted by unseen forces, was being corrected through pain. And then there was fire. The burning of witches is remembered now with horror, and rightly so. But in the minds of the time, it was not only about punishment. It was about cleansing. Fire, they believed, could purify. It could remove not just the body, but the stain the body left behind. It could erase fear by destroying its vessel. And so the stakes were built, dry wood gathered, sentences spoken. The condemned was tied, often gently, almost ritually. The flames were lit not with rage, but with solemnity. And in the flickering heat, the people stood, not all angry, not all cruel, but bound together in a desperate hope that the burning would chase the darkness away. Some of the accused confessed, not because they were guilty, but because they were exhausted, starved, deprived of sleep, promised mercy if they only spoke the words. And so they confessed to flying through the night, to dancing with demons, to poisoning wells and cursing fields. Their confessions grew wild, shaped by suggestion and repetition, and every word fed the fear, for every which named another. And so the circle grew. No one was safe. A neighbor one day, an accuser the next, a friend today, a stranger tomorrow. And yet, even in the grip of fear, not all believed. There were voices, quiet ones, that questioned, that hesitated. Some priests urged mercy. Some judges demanded proof. Some towns refused to burn, even when pressured. But their voices were drowned in the rising tide of superstition, in the sermons of traveling preachers, in the cries of grieving mothers and starving peasants. When the world made no sense, it was easier to blame the unseen than to face the truth of chaos. Men, too, were accused, though less often. Those who lived alone, those who spoke too freely, those whose dreams seemed too vivid. Madness was not understood. Illness had no name. And in the absence of knowledge, the imagination filled the space. A man who heard voices, a girl who shook and wept without reason, a boy who spoke in tongues. They were not treated with care. They were punished, exorcised, bound, forgotten. And yet, in the ashes of these burnings, in the quiet of the cells where the accused once lay, something remained. Not just grief, not just memory, but a question, a lingering sense that justice had wandered too far into the dark, that fear had worn the robes of law, and that the flames had burned more than wood and flesh. They had burned a piece of the world's soul. And now, as we walk slowly away from the smoke, from the chains, from the water and the whip and the silent accusations, we feel that shift from superstition back to structure, from fear to rule. For in the late Middle Ages, a change began, a tightening, a codifying, the rise of laws written not just by kings, but by councils, courts that began to standardize punishment, records that sought not just to remember, but to regulate. We move now toward that next turning of the wheel, toward the slow, grinding birth of legal order, not yet modern, not yet fair, but different, more deliberate, more uniform, as though, at last, the world had grown weary of shadows and fire, and began to search for something more solid to stand on. There comes a moment in every long journey when the dust begins to settle, and the shouting gives way to murmurs, when chaos, once so loud and constant, begins to take shape. Not order, perhaps, not yet, but outlines, patterns, the first hints of structure in the swirling mist. And in the late Middle Ages, after the fires of superstition had scorched both earth and memory, the world began to reach for something steadier, something that could be written and read and repeated, a different kind of justice, not whispered from priest to peasant, but scratched onto parchment, sealed with wax, and sent across kingdoms, the rise of legal codes. It did not happen all at once. No trumpet sounded. No decree echoed through every village at the same time. It was slower than that, softer, a change in texture, not in shape. The church, so often the architect of fear, began to shape guidelines. Councils were convened. Canons were drafted. Punishments, once left to the imagination of local lords or the rage of the crowd, began to appear in lists. tables of offenses and their proper remedies. Theft, so many lashes. Adultery, so many coins. Heresy, death or penance or exile. There were variations, of course. A list in one city might differ from the next, but the act of listing itself changed everything, because with lists came limits. Justice began to carry boundaries. A man accused of a crime might not fear endless invention, but a known response. A woman might not face burning for gossip, but instead a defined fine or a formal rebuke. The punishments were still harsh, still physical, still humiliating, but they were less often wild, less often shaped by whim or superstition. And in that slow tightening of law, there was, for some, a kind of safety. The kingdoms, too, began to take notice. Rulers sought to control not just the roads and rivers, but the courts. Kings sent judges to travel, to ride circuit through towns and hear cases. Royal laws were written and copied. Some were preserved in Latin, others in early tongues that could be read by the growing class of scribes and city folk. And as these laws spread, they carried with them a strange promise that justice, at least in theory, might one day look the same in every town. It was far from perfect. There were still cruel lords and corrupt officials, still prisons that swallowed men whole, still punishments that lingered in the imagination like bruises in the sky. But the idea of justice, not as vengeance or spectacle or panic, but as a process, began to take root. Trials were held with witnesses, with written testimony. Accusations had to be proved, at least more often than before. Torture, though still used, was debated in learned halls. And while the axe still fell and the fire still burned, the choice to use them was no longer quite so casual. The church's role shifted, too. No longer merely punisher, it became interpreter. Its clerics debated not just sin, but law. They copied Roman legal texts, studied the codes of Justinian, translated fragments of ancient wisdom that had long slumbered in libraries. From these pages came systems, strange, contradictory, sometimes rigid, sometimes compassionate, but systems nonetheless. And once law became a system, punishment had to follow. The punishments, in this more regulated world, took on new patterns. Fines were standardized. Stocks and pillories were codified into town charters. Whipping became a known response to particular crimes, no longer a punishment chosen in anger, but assigned by rank. Death was still used, but more often with ceremony, after proper trial, under written justification. And the gallows, though still built of wood, were now built under law. This shift did not make justice gentle. It did not make it fair, but it made it legible. A poor man might still suffer, but he might also know, in some distant way, why. And those with power, though still able to bend the law, could no longer claim that law did not exist. In the cities, guilds began to play a role. They wrote rules for their members, about conduct, about theft, about honor. A dishonest tanner, a thieving smith, a cheating baker. These were no longer judged by rumor or mob, but by councils. Fines were paid. Names were blackened in ledgers. In this way, shame became structured. Reputations were no longer merely spoken. They were recorded, and with records came memory. A man punished once might find it written in the city's book. Years later, should he err again, the parchment would remember. Punishment began to stretch across time, linking past the present in ways never before possible. It was not only the body that bore the scar. Now the name did too. Some saw this as progress, others as another cage. For written law could be as unforgiving as the rope, and though superstition lost its hold, bureaucracy took its place. Petty crimes were tracked, minor faults punished. The joy of life, its mess, its mercy, could vanish under the cold ink of rules. And yet, beneath the rigidity, there was still space for humanity. Some judges tempered law with wisdom. Some towns offered alternative punishments, labor, charity, exile, instead of death. And some punished with an eye toward reform rather than only revenge. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the idea emerged that punishment might serve not only to wound, but to guide, that justice one day might teach. It was a long road, centuries long. And for every village that embraced legal codes, another clung to old ways. For every case heard with fairness, another was twisted by fear or greed. But the shift had begun. From torchlight to parchment, from a shout of the mob to the scratch of the scribe. And now, as we step gently away from these ink-stained scrolls, these books bound in leather and ruled with lines, we find ourselves once more at crossroads. For though justice now carried structure, it still carried power. And power, when threatened, does not always follow its own rules. And so, in the late Middle Ages and into the early modern world, we turn toward one final shape of punishment. Not chaos, not custom, not codified law, but control. We walk now toward the age of the spectacle, of punishments meant not only to correct or deter, but to dominate, to make a statement, not to the guilty, but to everyone. The law had been written, the scrolls stacked neatly in city halls and castle archives, the trials held with more structure, the names recorded in ledgers that grew thicker with each passing year. And yet, as justice became more formal, more careful, more clothed in robes and rules, another need arose, one that the parchment could not satisfy. For power does not only wish to be obeyed, it wishes to be seen, it wishes to be felt. And so, even in an age of growing legal codes and written judgments, punishment took on a second life, one not of paper and seals, but of eyes and voices and trembling bodies gathered in the square. The age of spectacle had begun. Punishment, now, was not only meant to address the guilty, it was meant to shape the innocent. It was meant to teach, to frighten, to burn a message into the minds of those who watched. And so the scaffold was raised higher, its steps steeper, its wood polished to draw the light. The gallows moved to the center of the town. The executioner was given a uniform, a hood, a mask, a black coat, not to hide shame, but to complete the image. And when justice was performed, it was performed with the weight of theater, with a careful rhythm of process and pain. Crowds were no longer merely present. They were expected. Punishments were announced ahead of time. The hour declared. Bells rung. Word passed through markets and chapels. From brewer to baker, from shepherd to scribe. A hanging at sunrise, a branding at noon, a flogging at the third bell. And when the time came, the town gathered, not all with cruelty in their hearts, but with a kind of uneasy duty. It was not just curiosity. It was participation, a performance that needed its audience. For if no one watched, what lesson would be learned? The condemned became part of the story. Some walked the scaffold silently, surrounded by guards, their faces pale beneath hoods or veils. Others shouted their innocence or their guilt or sermons of their own making, turning the moment into a strange, defiant final act. Some wept, some sang, some could not walk and were dragged, but all were visible. That was the point. Justice, in this age, was not only about righting a wrong. It was about showing power, making power felt, etching power into memory. Execution was not always quick. Sometimes it was drawn out, carefully, deliberately. A man sentenced to be broken on the wheel might be tied beneath the sky as the crowd waited. The executioner would strike with iron, first at the legs, then the arms, then the ribs. The bones shattered one by one, the pain rippling to the square like heat. There were intervals between the blows, pauses for breath, for effect, for reaction. And when it was done or nearly done, the broken body might be left there, tied to the wheel, raised like a twisted scarecrow, until life faded into stillness. Burnings, too, became more orchestrated. The fire arranged to burn slowly, for longer. The wood soaked the smoke before it flamed. The condemned dressed in particular ways. Their crimes read aloud, their words recorded by scribes perched nearby. In one town, executions began with music. In another, with prayer. And in every town, the spectacle was designed not just to punish the body before the flame, but to cauterize the thoughts of those who watched, to bind them more tightly to the idea that justice, real and terrible, walked among them. Even lesser punishments bore the signs of spectacle. A public flogging was not done in a corner, but in the open square. A pillory was placed at the crossroads, where every passerby could stop, stare, perhaps shout or throw something small. Branding irons were heated in daylight. Stocks were made to be uncomfortable, not just for the body, but for the soul. The point was not pain alone. The point was humiliation, public memory, communal witness. And so the people watched, not always with hatred, not always with glee, often with silence, sometimes with prayer. A mother might clutch her child's hand tightly. A husband might pull his wife's shawl over her eyes. A child might peek through fingers, then look away. It was not entertainment, not truly. It was participation in something larger, older, more terrible than any single moment could explain. It was a ceremony of obedience. And yet, in every crowd there were questions, quiet ones, eyes that lingered too long on the condemned, thoughts that surfaced unbidden. Is this just? Did he deserve this? Could I ever stand there? Would they do this to me if I... The spectacle taught, yes, but what it taught was not always what the rulers intended. For power, even when loud, always leaves behind a shadow, and in that shadow, doubt can grow. Some towns began to resist. Slowly, quietly, a magistrate might refuse a sentence. A priest might protest the burning of a penitent. A crowd might grow restless, not from rage, but from discomfort. The theater of justice was powerful, but relied on its audience remaining still, silent, obedient. And when obedience wavered, even a little, the performance became brittle. But still, for many years, spectacle ruled. Kings held public executions as warnings. Rebels were drawn and quartered in the capital, their body parts sent to corners of the kingdom. Fugitives, once caught, were paraded on carts. Heads were mounted on spikes, words carved into chests, banners unfurled above the gallows. And all of it, always, was meant to be seen, because power, when afraid, becomes loud. And the louder it shouts, the more desperate often is. And so the age of spectacle, for all its noise, for all its sharp edges and screaming crowds, began to show cracks. The people, wearied by blood. The scribes questioned the books they copied. The judges, wondering about mercy. Even the executioners, at times, drank more deeply as they try and forget their own part in the endless play. And now, as we turn from the scaffold for the final time, we carry not just the image of punishment, but the echo of questions. What is justice, if it must be watched to be believed? What is law, if it needs fire and blade to stand? We walk now toward the final flickering chapters of this long, meandering journey, toward a world on the edge of change, where punishment, so long carved into the flesh, began to leave the body and enter the mind. We drift toward the earliest thoughts of reform, of mercy, of rehabilitation. Not fully born, not yet common, but visible, like the first faint stars of twilight, shimmering above a world still wrapped in shadow. The crowds had scattered. The blood had dried. The scaffold still stood, but the noise had faded, replaced by the creak of wind-blown rope, the tapping of wood against wood, the whisper of pigeons overhead. Justice, long a spectacle of smoke and steel, had shouted itself hoarse. And in the hush that followed, in the soft footsteps of returning villagers, in the long, thoughtful silences of scribes and scholars, something else began to rise. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, delicately, like ivy curling up old stone. It was the idea that justice could do something more than punish. That perhaps, just perhaps, it could begin to heal. The Middle Ages were not known for kindness. Mercy was not the language of rulers or law. But even in that hard and flint-edged world, the weight of centuries began to press upon the hearts of those who watched, who judged, who enforced. Not all at once, not everywhere, but here and there, in the corners of monastic libraries, in the chambers of aging clerics, in the notes scribbled beside legal texts, we find traces of doubt. Hints that the old ways were being questioned, that the endless cycle of pain and punishment might not be the only answer. Perhaps it was weariness. Perhaps the repetition of cruelty had dulled its edge. Or perhaps the world itself was changing. Cities were growing. Books were multiplying. Pilgrims and merchants carried more than goods. They carried ideas. And among those ideas was a new thought, fragile but persistent, that even the guilty might be human, that wrongdoing might come from need or ignorance or desperation, not only wickedness, and that to respond with only lash and gallows was to miss something essential. In universities, which by the 14th and 15th centuries have become small islands of thought, scholars debated not just theology, but justice. They revisited the old Roman laws, the dusty glosses of long-dead jurists. They translated Aristotle. They argued, sometimes gently, sometimes fiercely, about punishment, its purpose, its effect, its limits. Was it meant to hurt or to restore? Could it be just if it broke the spirit of the punished? And what of the soul? Did a flogged man come closer to salvation or further? These were not yet the cries of reformers, not yet the manifestos of revolution, but they were seeds, and seeds, given time, grow roots. In some places, magistrates began to take notice. Not often, not universally, but there were judgments passed down that swapped death for exile, whipping for labor, branding for enforced prayer or religious instruction. The punishments remained, but they shifted, became, in rare cases, more tailored. A thief might be forced to make restitution rather than lose a hand. A liar might serve in a hospital rather than rot in a cell. These were not common, but they happened, and every time they did, the idea of justice stretched just slightly toward mercy. Even the church, so long a stern enforcer, showed flickers of compassion. In confessionals, some priests counseled not just repentance, but repair. Monasteries sometimes offered sanctuary, not as escape from justice, but as space for reflection, a place where the wrongdoer could, through prayer and service, reshape his path. The old idea of penance, of pain as purification, softened at the edges. Suffering gave way, in some corners, to instruction. And yet, for each flicker of mercy, there were still flames of cruelty. The wheels still turned. The nooses still swayed. Public punishment remained the law's favorite weapon. But now, alongside it, there were questions. Quiet ones. Questions written into the margins of law books, murmured in courts, preached in sermons. What good is punishment if it makes a man worse? What justice is there in destroying what might be rebuilt? The idea of rehabilitation had no name then, but it had a shape. A criminal who returned to the community, changed. A woman who, having paid a price, was allowed to work, to live, to love. A child caught stealing who was taught, not whipped. These were stories told in the small spaces, not yet the law of the land, but visions of another way. And over time, these visions gathered strength. Part of this change was practical. Prisons were expensive. Executions took time, resources, ceremony. As towns swelled and crimes multiplied, rulers looked for cheaper, more efficient means. Punishments that maintained order without endless blood. And so, labor became a sentence. Road work, cleaning, building, the punished made useful. A form of justice that profited the city. Harsh still, but different. And part of it, too, was human. Executioners, once feared and needed, began to retire with unease. Some refused to pass their trade to their sons. Some wept as they worked. They had seen too much, done too much. And the people, those watching, began to shift too. Children cried. Mothers turned away. The gallows still drew a crowd, but the eyes within it were changing. Art began to reflect these changes. Paintings showed not only punishment, but pity. Plays questioned authority. Poems described the condemned not as monsters, but as tragic. Literature, once a vehicle for moral certainty, began to shimmer with ambiguity. And in those shimmers, the old narrative, that justice must always hurt, began to bend. Not all welcomed the change. Many resisted. A world built on fear does not give up its tools easily. But mercy, once imagined, cannot be unimagined. And though the centuries ahead would bring their own terrors, the idea had taken root that punishment might serve not just as an end, but as a beginning. And so, as we leave this chapter, we do not step into a world of peace. The Middle Ages still hold their grip, but the grip is loosening. And in the spaces where iron once ruled without question, new thoughts now bloom, soft, persistent, patient. And from this quieter place, We begin to drift toward the twilight of the medieval world itself. The horizon glows with distant change. The Renaissance approaches. The laws will shift. The cities will grow louder. But for now, we pause here, where mercy first began to murmur through the stones, where a different kind of justice, not softer, but wiser, first stirred in the hearts of men. The air had changed, not in any dramatic way. No trumpet blasts, no royal decrees echoing from cathedral towers, but in the quiet, nearly imperceptible shift that comes before spring. The scent of damp earth, the softening of frozen fields, the sense that something, long held in place, had begun to give. And in the closing chapters of the Middle Ages, punishment, so long rooted in bone, fire, and spectacle, began to dim. It did not vanish. It did not reform itself in a single generation, but it faded like the final smoke from a torch burned too long. And as it did, a new world began to stir in the distance. It was not a single force that drove this slow unraveling. It was many. Cities had grown, their walls no longer keeping out ideas. Printing presses, still young, began to whisper change. Universities hummed with voices that questioned and challenged and reframed. The old maps of power were shifting, and the people, the countless many who had watched, suffered, endured, or simply wondered, were no longer quite the same. The scaffold still stood, but its shadows were thinner. No longer did every crime demand flesh. The pillory, once a mark of communal judgment, began to crack beneath its own shame. Executions, though still practiced, became less theatrical. Some rulers, weary of the unrest they often provoked, moved them to more remote fields or scheduled them at inconvenient hours. Justice was beginning to retreat from the square, retreat from the crowd. It had grown tired of being watched. What replaced it at first was not mercy, but bureaucracy. The ink grew thicker, the laws more layered, courts multiplied, judges multiplied, scribes filled ledgers until their hands blistered. But in all that paper, something changed. Punishment became slower, less impulsive. The heat of wrath cooled beneath the weight of documentation. And when cruelty did still rise, it had to justify itself, had to explain itself in terms the new world understood. Rational terms, legal terms, not just because the king said so, but because the code requires it. Power was learning to speak a different language. And in that language, there was room, small, trembling room, for questions. Why must we break a man for stealing bread? Why must a body suffer endlessly for sins that were shaped by poverty or hunger or desperation? Why must we teach by hurting? The questions grew louder, written not just in dusty monasteries, but in pamphlets passed through cities, in debates held before students and kings alike. What had been whispered became spoken, and though the old punishments still clung to life, they no longer felt inevitable. They felt old. Some of the changes were structural. Prisons were reorganized, still grim, still bleak, but now more formal. The rules of confinement codified. The purpose of imprisonment began to shift from pure waiting or erasure to something else. Management, control, perhaps even rehabilitation, though that word had not yet found its full shape. The very idea that time itself could serve as a punishment, time to reflect, to change, was still young, but was there like a seed beneath stone. And part of the shift came from those once silenced. Writers, thinkers, common folk. People who had been beaten or watched their loved ones taken. People who saw the cruelty not as justice, but as fear dressed in law. And they began to write, to speak, to protest in gentle ways. Not always with firebrands, but with stories, letters, questions posed to bishops. Pamphlets slipped under doors. And slowly, the weight of centuries began to tilt. But the old punishments did not vanish peacefully. There were still bursts of fire, still parades of death, still judges who ruled with ire hearts. Inquisition courts still whispered through candlelit rooms. Torture chambers were not yet empty. The transition was not clean. It was a tug of war between the old world of divine fear and the new world of reason, between punishment as performance and punishment as process. Yet, even amid the lingering horror, change could be felt. A woman accused of theft might be sentenced not to the whip, but to labor. A man once destined for hanging might be exiled instead. Some rulers, influenced by new philosophies, reduced death sentences, preferring long confinement or re-education. The ideas were spreading. The Enlightenment, though not yet fully born, was beginning to cast its long, pale light backward across the medieval dusk. And so, justice began to climb down from the scaffold and back into the courtroom. No longer a theater of terror. It became, in parts of Europe, an institution of argument, still flawed, still brutal, but now layered with thought. The punishment no longer screamed. It reasoned. It justified. And in that shift, the law itself began to transform. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria, though still years ahead, would soon write that punishment should be swift, certain, and proportionate, that the aim was not pain, but deterrence. That death, once a common sentence, was not only cruel but ineffective. These ideas would reshape the coming centuries. But even before the ink dried, the world was already bending in their direction. And so we find ourselves at last near the end of a long corridor lined with ropes, flames, iron, and silence. A corridor that echoes with cries, not just of the punished, but of those who question why the punishment existed at all. The Middle Ages, in all their heavy, brutal complexity, had taught the world how to fear. But in their final centuries, they also taught it, very quietly, how to begin thinking again. We step now from that long corridor toward the threshold of a new age. Not free from cruelty, not free from injustice, but different. A world where pain would not be the only measure of wrongdoing. A world where courts would eventually look not only at the act, but at the person, at motive, at context. A world that would try, however imperfectly, to understand before condemned. And so, we leave behind the scaffold, the stocks, the fire. We leave behind the pillories and the dungeons and the jeering crowds. We carry their memory, yes, their weight, but we do not carry their certainty. For even the darkest punishments, the most brutal systems, are not eternal. They fade, they change, and in the stillness that follows, something softer begins to grow. The stones are quiet now. The torches have long since burned out. The ropes have frayed. The wheels have rusted in the rain. And yet, somehow, the air still remembers. Not with words, but with weight. A heaviness that clings to the corners of old squares, the cracks in ancient walls, the silence inside cathedrals where trials once echoed. The world has moved on. Cities paved, towers fallen, laws rewritten. But the memory of medieval justice lingers, like smoke that seeps into wood and never quite leaves. We no longer hang men in public squares. We no longer brand the foreheads of thieves or drown suspected witches to see if they float. The tools are gone. The rituals faded. And yet, the spirit of that time, the fear, the spectacle, the hunger to punish, has not vanished completely. It lingers in the way we still speak of crime, in the stories we tell, in the punishments we still carry out, sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly, behind high walls where few are invited to look. In many ways, justice has changed. Courts now speak in terms of rights, of representation, of due process. But beneath the robes, beneath the gavels and transcripts and clean white walls, there is still something ancient moving beneath the surface. A kind of remembering. A thread that stretches back to the whipping posts and the iron collars and the silence that followed each blow. We try to forget. We try to be better. But memory is a patient thing. And it's not just in the courts. It's in our culture, our architecture, our language. Towns still bear the names of gallows hills. Roads still lead to fields once soaked in judgment. Old prison stones are now repurposed into libraries or cafes. But if you press your hand to them, sometimes, just sometimes, it feels like they remember. Not with sorrow, not with guilt, just with the weight of having been there when pain was law. Even in the way we entertain ourselves, the ghosts of punishment linger. In dramas, in films, in the fascination with the medieval, the dungeons, the trials, the executioner's mask. We watch not only to learn, but to feel. And what we feel sometimes is something the Middle Ages knew well. The tension between justice and cruelty, between order and fear. between the need to correct and the temptation. Why does punishment fascinate us still? Perhaps because deep down we understand its power, not only over the body, but over the mind, over society itself. Punishment is not only an act, it is a message, a performance, a way of reminding people where the lines are drawn and what happens when you step beyond them. And though the methods have changed, the instinct remains. The same instinct that once built scaffolds and lit torches now builds walls and writes sentences that stretch across decades. The tools may differ, but the emotions beneath them often feel the same. And yet, and this is important, we have learned, slowly, painfully, unevenly we have learned, we have begun to ask better questions. To imagine that justice might involve more than pain. That accountability need not mean destruction. That to punish can also mean to teach, to repair, even to redeem. These are fragile ideas, still young, still debated, still far from perfect, but they grow where memory remains. Because history does not only serve to frighten, it can also illuminate. To remember what was done, to whom, by whom, and why, is not to glorify cruelty. It is to understand its roots, its appeal, its cost. And in that understanding there is hope. For if we can trace the art of punishment, from fire and rack to thought and reflection, we can also trace the path toward mercy, toward balance, toward a justice that does not only look backward in anger, but forward in wisdom. Somewhere in a small museum in a quiet European town, there sits a rusted pair of shackles. They are laid behind glass. No explanation is needed. They do not move. They do not speak. But people stop. They stare. And in their silence, there is a strange communion between the past and the present, between the hand that once held the whip and the eyes that now read its story, between what was and what must never be again. In these quiet moments of reflection, justice changes not through law, but through memory, through the soft decision, made in courtrooms and classrooms and conversations, that we will not go back, that we will build differently, that punishment, if it must exist, will serve the living, not glorify the pain of the past. And so the story of medieval punishment does not end with a scream or a torch. It ends with a whisper, with a breath, with the slow exhale of a world waking from a long, cruel dream and turning, ever so gently, toward the light. And here, dear listener, as the final echoes fade into silence, we find ourselves no longer in the middle of the square, or in the flickering candlelight of a cold stone cell. We are somewhere else entirely, somewhere soft, somewhere warm. You have walked a long road, not with your feet, but with your mind, a journey through darkness, yes, but also through change, through memory, through the strange, winding path of human justice. Let your breath deepen now. Let your body rest. There is nothing left to do. The punishments are gone. The story is told. And all that remains is stillness. And now, dear listener, we come to the end. Not the end of punishment or history or human struggle, for those things never end, but the end of the story. This slow and winding walk through a world once shaped by flame and chain, by silence and spectacle, by fear, and by the yearning, however faint, however distant, for something gentler, something better. You've walked a long way, not through battlefields or forests or palaces, but through a quieter landscape, through courtrooms without gavel, through cells without light, through centuries where justice was carved into flesh and then forgotten. And yet you kept walking, step by step, word by word, Lannon held steady. You watched the scaffold rise. You saw the faces in the crowd. You felt the chill of iron, the dry whisper of parchment, the distant toll of bells announcing one more sentence, one more lesson. And you did not turn away. And now the path narrows. The echoes fade. The crowd has dispersed. The torches have guttered out. And the last page of this long, shadow book lies open beneath the quiet glow of imagined candlelight. There is no judgment here. No fear. Only stillness. The world we've left behind, the world of medieval punishment, was not just cruel. It was complex. It was a mirror reflecting back the values of a time we do not belong to, but still carry pieces of. It showed us how fear can shape justice, how ritual can become cruelty, and how silence, that heavy, enduring silence, can do as much harm as the whip. But it also showed us something else, something quieter, that even in the deepest dark, people still ask questions, still reach for fairness, still imagine a better way. And it is in that reaching, hesitant, fragile, unfinished, that hope lives. That's what we carry forward. Not the pain, but the possibility. Not the chains, but the choice. So now, as you rest, you don't need to remember every fact. You don't need to recall every name or every method or every ancient decree. That's not why we came here. We came for something softer. A rhythm, a drifting, a slow descent into peace. The story was never meant to startle or awaken. It was meant to soothe, to ease the mind into gentleness, to let you feel time stretch and breath deepen and thought unravel itself into nothingness. And if somewhere along the way your eyes grew heavy, if your thoughts blurred the lines between memory and dream, then that is enough. That is more than enough. That is exactly what stories like this are meant to do. Not to teach, not to frighten, but to carry. To lift you gently, like a boat on still water, away from the busy shore today, and toward the quiet beyond. Tonight, you may dream of stone walls and moss-covered paths, of forgotten towns and cloaked figures fading into fog. You may see a gallows in the distance, no longer in use, or a courtroom with empty benches and dust in the beams. But more likely, you will not dream at all. You will rest, deeply, quietly, without burden. For the weight of this story has been set down now, like a satchel at the foot of a long trail. You have made it here, and here you are safe. Let your breath slow now. Let your muscles soften. The voice will soon fade, and with it, the last echo of ancient bells. There is nothing left to do, nothing to decide. The world turns quietly without you. The night holds you without asking. You are far from the square now, far from a flame, far from a fear. What remains is only stillness, the soft, endless hush that waits beneath all things. Let it rise. Let it fill the space where worry once lived. Let it cradle you, rock you, keep you. The story is over. The night is long. And you are safe. You are still. You are free. Sleep now. Sleep.